This is a short introduction to Paul's letter to the Colossians. You know, Paul was a man with largeness of heart for the churches. He planted churches, he wrote to churches, he visited churches to strengthen the Christians there. Paul truly loved God's people. I think we could say with confidence that after Jesus, Paul is certainly the greatest example of a shepherd in the New Testament. He really did have a true pastoral heart. So when we read any of Paul's letters, whichever one it is, we can be sure it's written by a man who truly loved the church and so wrote from that perspective. So whether he's writing to an individual like Timothy or Titus, or whether he's writing to a church, he loved the church, he desired that Christians go on for God, and he prayed for them to that end, and he wrote these letters full of instruction to help them in their Christian lives. So whenever we read one of Paul's letters, we can be sure they're not clinical letters, but they're expressions of his love and concern for God's people. So just some quick information on Colossians. The city of Colossae was in a region called Phrygia in modern-day Turkey. It was an inland town on the edge of a river. The population was a mixture of Jews and non-Jews. This letter, it's estimated, was written around AD 60 to 63, while Paul was a prisoner. So it's important to note that Paul didn't write this from a luxurious setting. We might write a letter on an email from an air-conditioned office or from a lounge chair, but Paul says in chapter 4 verse 10 that he had a fellow prisoner called Aristarchus, and in chapter 4:18 he talks about being in chains. So it certainly wasn't written from a luxurious setting. How did the church start? Well, we're told in chapter 1 that Epaphras was the messenger. He took the gospel to Colossae and the people believed, and a church there was established. It's always good to ask, what are the purposes of any book of the Bible? And what are the purposes of this particular letter? Paul wrote to the Colossians to counteract false teaching, and in so doing he exalts Jesus Christ, because there were people who were devaluing and demoting Jesus, even encouraging the worship of angels. And anytime you add something to Jesus, you take away from the value of Jesus. So you can imagine Paul getting fired up about that, and he writes back to them and just shows them Jesus' authority and his supremacy, and he truly does exalt Jesus Christ. Did you know that in this letter, it's only 4 chapters long, but in this letter, the word Christ is used 26 times. So Paul really emphasizes Jesus Christ in this letter. And Colossians is up there with Hebrews as one of the most Christ-exalting letters in the whole New Testament. The second purpose is that Paul, as he typically did in his letters, gives instruction for Christian living. So when you're reading Colossians, you're going to find teaching for Christians about holy living and displaying Christian character, and he urges them to go on for God. For example, in chapter 2, verse 6, he says, "Just as you received Christ Jesus the Lord, so continue to live your lives in him." So Paul encourages the Christians to go on for God. And the major theme of the letter, the preeminence and the sufficiency of Christ. And as we read through the letter, and it's great to read it 2 or 3 times, just notice all the times that Paul mentions Jesus and truly does exalt Jesus.